I think a good school today doesn't necessarily meet the same definition as a good school 20 years ago. That a good school 20 years ago was constituted largely by high test scores. And while test scores remain important, increasingly today schools need to refocus from the sort of standardized curriculum, standardized experience, and begin to look more and more at learners. The good school of today, and I think even more of tomorrow, is a school that starts with the learner, that asks what the learner needs, and takes the learner forward regardless of whether they come from a family that has a history of formal education or have all the resources that we might wish they had. But that really good school today, and I think even more tomorrow, will be the school that focuses on the learner, that builds the learner's capacity to learn, not just their capacity to be taught, that spark in learners' curiosity and imagination and possibility, not just a focus on, can I get good grades? When the metrics start to change, and I think they are starting to change, we're asking different questions, we're holding different expectations of schools and of graduates than we did in the past. And Wisconsin has had pockets of innovation around this sort of redesign, and there's some really good profiles of schools within Wisconsin as a whole, and southeastern Wisconsin particularly, who've really thought deeply about how we develop the learner, not just how we train good students. And so I would say Wisconsin is competitive, but that's not saying much in terms of transforming the system. Most adults experience the traditional system, and it's hard for them to imagine a system that would be different from that. I mean, their idea was the teacher came in, the teacher told you what to do, you do what the teacher says, and if you do all that, good things happen. And that was a reasonable value proposition 20 years ago. It becomes less and less of a reasonable value proposition today. Today it's more a matter of what's the talent you have that I can develop? What is it that really interests you that I can tap to ensure that you learn what you need to learn, but in the middle of that I'm also capturing your imagination. I'm building a sense of purpose that allows you to become not just a well-trained worker, but a creative, creating worker who not only can do the job, but can create new ones. The challenge of becoming more competitive, I think, is both important and evolving. But among the drivers, I think, in that competition are one, that we commit to having all learners learn. The second is to go beyond the idea of we need to teach students the curriculum, to building in them the capacity to be learners, including in an independent situation. That the future is far from predictable, other than we know it's going to change rapidly. So simply giving students a set of facts or a cluster of information isn't adequate. That next level of preparing young people to be learners, not just students, is really an important element. And I think that represents a significant competitive advantage, not just for the schools, but for our state. That if we can prepare graduates who are flexible learners, who know how to learn when taught, but also know how to learn in situations that are far less clear, that are much murkier, we create now the opportunity to be competitive in an environment that's going to change, that's unpredictable.
The number one factor of determining family wealth in this state and in the country is whether or not you own a home. And so what we need to do in the public policy arena is to make sure we're doing everything possible to get new homes constructed, to get people to move into those homes, and to rebuild both the middle class and the housing economy and the state's economy. If we're to build a stronger economy in this state, we need workers. We have a worker shortage now. If we're going to have employers create the jobs that we want in economic development, the primary priority for that is to house those workers. And they have to be able to be housed at all different levels of incomes and housing. And so this has to be a priority for the state of Wisconsin, or we're not going to get the economic growth we want, and we're not going to be able to retain or attract workers to the state because we simply don't have places for them to stay. So what are the causes for our affordable housing shortages? Well, first of all, it's supply. We simply don't have enough supply of houses in the marketplace. We're still about 55% of what we used to be pre-recession for buildable lots and for housing units in the state of Wisconsin. So we still haven't gotten back our capacity to build homes to keep up with our demand. So supply is a big issue. Construction costs are a big issue. That's both in materials that people need for building homes, but also on the labor side. The labor force that left during the recession hasn't really come back, and that's putting upward pressures on the cost of housing as well. And then there's land use policies. Across the state of Wisconsin and municipalities and counties all over the state, we have different kinds of restrictive land use policies that have limited the supply of buildable lots, and that can come in many forms. It can be in the form of requiring large minimum lot sizes, which means builders have to build larger homes to be able to build in those kind of settings. And so restrictive land use policies are also one of the causes of our affordable housing in the state of Wisconsin. The urgency is a priority. I think for the first time in all the years that I've been advocating for housing and real estate development, you see that all levels of government has said housing, affordable housing is a priority in the state of Wisconsin. And so to make that a priority, what has to happen? There are public policies that have to change at the state and the local level, but there's all kinds of agencies that work together, whether it's in land use, whether it's in construction, whether it's in taxes, whether it's in permitting. That happens at all levels of government. If we're going to produce the housing we need today, not 10 or 15 years ago, but the housing we need today, those public policy organizations have to get together to make housing a priority and to make sure that we have the housing there when the jobs are there.
In Waukesha County, we have a workforce problem. We don't have enough bodies for the jobs that are here. That's a great thing to have. At the same time, it's one of our largest challenges to try to figure out how to bring people here. And I think that's one of the things that we continue to work for and work with. For me, it's been exciting being in the position. There's a number of businesses that are starting to realize we need to be part of that whole conversation. When you look at it, we finally have, as I have said, kind of a neat convergence of the private sector businesses, the public sector, government, and education working finally together to say, okay, we've got to come to a same conclusion. And having that voice come in from the business side as well as the public side is what's been helpful. The challenge that we have is there are still some heavy hurdles. When you look at bringing people into Waukesha County or into Wisconsin, housing is always going to be probably the second number one topic right behind that workforce population. And that's something that we're trying to grapple with here. You know, when you look at Waukesha County, we have 37 municipalities, 37 different ways of looking at housing density, multifamily housing. And we have to get people to realize we've got to get on that same page. We've seen that with education in the 17-18 school year, so we're going into the second year now, the academic career profile that the students start developing is giving them an idea of what they want to do with their careers. But we have to capture people that have already been through school and people that are in businesses right now that are seeing changes in their industry. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing right now is our workforce is going to be number-wise about what we have, but we've got to figure out how to create the skill sets for those workers to perform in the next 5 to 10 years of what the jobs are going to bring. It's shifted because we had a great run in the baby boomers who took the population and kept moving it forward, but we never looked back to say, okay, how do we prepare for the next generation? We had all this capacity for us, but we haven't put this capacity back in for them to have. And I think that's where the focus is going to be for us as we move forward, is how do we make sure that we give this generation the steps that they need to make those incremental growths that we did as we moved along the path. What you have to look at is this isn't a 10-year lookout that we're trying to get accomplished. This is something that we need to get done within the next 24 months.
During the video comments, each of you talked about things that we need to do in the state, whether it's around education, housing, reskilling employees. As you think about those important things that we need to do, are they happening in other states right now? And would you say that we are ahead or behind when it comes to doing these important things in our state, again, whether it's around education, housing, reskilling, et cetera?
I think what's happening around the country in trying to rethink about education from a learner-centered perspective rather than an instruction-driven perspective, that it's popping up in a lot of places. There are not a lot of statewide initiatives. It's more a ground-up clustering that I think is starting to form into a movement. So I would say there are maybe half a dozen states around the country where there's some serious work going on. There are another 15 states maybe where there are examples, and there are some states where there's really not anything going on at all.
There are places across the country that are doing more in the area of affordable housing, and I actually think that affordable housing is one of those differentiators that we have in Wisconsin right now. We're losing it as we speak, but it's something that I think with the right attention and investment, that could be one of those differentiating moments for us here. Other states have tried things. Governor Evers put into his state budget in the early part of the year a program that would provide first-time home buyers with a savings account, like you do in EdVest, where you can put money away at a tax-free or lower tax consequence to be able to be put in for a down payment on a house if you're a first-time home buyer. That was a great idea. It's been tried in other states. It's worked in other states. There's separate legislation on that right now, but the legislature decided not to include it in the state budget. But those types of incentives, we talked about, Darren talked about some of the ones that we saw across the north and the east coast. So you do have public policies that are going towards incentivizing either the construction of housing or the ownership of housing that I think Wisconsin needs to catch up on. And like I said in my video, the good news is that at all levels of government, even the federal government, we're talking about having a housing focus, a housing crisis, and that we need to do something at all three levels of government.
I think across the country there are states that are doing things differently. And I think if you listen to this whole day, you've heard reasons why. I know Tim talked about a differentiated taxation system that we have, where we're more property tax and sales tax. So there's a different revenue streams that we have. Jim brought up the question earlier, kind of the what are we trying to get accomplished in the overall picture. When you think about it, back in the 50s and 60s, as the generations kept coming up, the goal was to always have the next generation better than us. Our next generation is going to get better than us. We got to the baby boomers, and the baby boomers says, we're pretty dang good. We're going to have the best generation there ever is. Oh, we got to do something about our kids. And I'm right in the tail end. I'm a 64 board kid. So I'm right at the end of the baby boomers or the X's. Depends on which one I really want to feel like I'm doing right now. But I think that's part of our challenge. We took off. And when you look at our history, we took off in the late 60s, 70s, and the 80s, everything exploded. And we didn't think much about what's to the next generation. And so I think Wisconsin right now, we've got a lot of really good things that are working and are starting to work well. The challenge is we've got a lot of little things that we've got to clean up. And I think that's going to be part of the issue as I looked at this conversation we're having today. You can hear there's some pockets of things that are working, pockets of ideas that are effective, but we still don't have the overbridled urgency to say we've got to make a difference. We've got to change what we do. When I was sitting in the back of the room listening to today, I was thinking to myself, when I had my small business, when the economy took a hit in 2008 as a home inspector, thank you very much, you guys gave me a lot of business, my business dropped in half. Within 8 months, people weren't buying homes. So I had to retool and figure out what I had to do and started another company. We're at the level of government where we keep saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to keep piling on and keep piling on and keep piling on. But we never look back at government and say, what don't we need to do anymore? What can we get out of the way? What can we streamline? What can we drop out of government that the private sector can take care of more competitively now and more efficiently for us, so that we can focus on what we need to do? And I think that's part of the challenge that we have to face in government is we're looking at housing in the neighborhood initiative. We've been working in Waukesha County. Average home right now to build a house in Waukesha County is $500,000. Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I can't even afford that right now. And that's the challenge we have, is trying to create new homes and new opportunities. We're already hit the hurdle way too high. So even when we look at education and trying to figure out how we're going to do early childhood education, we don't have the capacity because we've never changed the model of how we supply the funds to it or how we evaluate what's happening in the schools. And I think what we need right now is a major overhaul in what we do.
I'm going to toss, I want to come back to that point in a second, and I want to reframe my question a little bit for you, Kaleem, because you did talk about some of what's happening in the other states when it comes to early childhood education, but you also spoke about some of the incredible results you're producing at one city. I mean, does Wisconsin have an opportunity to differentiate itself, do you think, in the early childhood education arena, and if so, how might we go about doing a better job of differentiating ourselves there?
Yeah, I do, and I'll be a little bit more specific than I was last time. One thing is understanding what the message could be that people can really rally around. I'm trying to challenge employers when they think about their workforce, start to think about them as families, because stable businesses are ultimately defined by, and in part, by stable families. The more stable your families are, the more successful your business sector is going to be. Having a lot of youth, too, in a business sector is okay, but if that defines your workforce, that's a very transient workforce. Often they move a lot, they move around a lot, they want a career build quickly. Stability can be challenged, so providing a place where families can succeed is really important, and then that's where I feel like Wisconsin could win. But we got to connect those strategies to other challenges and other ways we're trying to tackle those challenges. One has been, someone mentioned housing. The challenge with housing is that when you have population growth, so think about if we've made preschool education, early childhood education free in Wisconsin, it would attract a lot of people here. People would choose to stay where they felt there were quality schools, but the more people, the cost of housing and other services tend to go up, not down. And so Wisconsin has to figure out how does it allow for population growth while also ensuring that the cost of living, you think of San Francisco, places like that have grown tremendously, and most of us can't live there. So just real quick,
Yep.
I wanted to say that I do think Wisconsin could do it, but here's how. I'll give you a model that we're going to follow. I feel like, again, we got to look at the models that we already have that are succeeding. We've got to evaluate those models, not only look at the quality that they're producing in terms of young people, but how are they financed? What goes into making a quality school, and where could those funds come from also to support that effort? And then I think, we're going to do, like, I'm looking to hire right now 8 to 9 people to go to be in different places around Wisconsin where they are going to educate people in those local communities about the importance of early childhood education, while also getting feedback about what it would take for us to do it there from the mindset of the people around the state. Then what we want to do is codify that into a really concrete message, but also some strategies that we can use to start to actually push out information out there using television, using radio, using social media, to really dominate the market. So it's running like a campaign. And I've done this before. That's how we got all this change in Washington, D.C. We did something very similar using support from a variety of people across the country. We used the ground game. We ran it like a campaign. We used the air war after that. We saturated the market with information and talked to people on the ground multiple times. And ultimately what we ended up with in 18 months was significant policy change, and D.C. hasn't looked back since. And so I feel like we could do something here, but we have to look at what those models are. What does the data and evidence tell us, both financially but also qualitatively, and then start to really move information out there into communities across the state to generate that groundswell of support.
Back to Tim's earlier point about payment and stuff. A critical piece of the go forward, I think, is that what has worked for us since World War II is a set of equations that we built between cost, payment, and value. Okay? We're now having trouble with how those get sorted out. okay? Education, for example, nobody argues that education adds value, but it's difficult because you want your money up front, okay, before that's come in. So it's not that the value is not there, but when the value is realized financially is different than when you pay for it. Housing faces a similar kind of issue. There's no question, and we don't do full enough balance sheet, in my opinion. Housing does stable neighborhoods produce lower costs in education, lower costs in welfare issues, and public safety and everything else. Part of the go forward is saying, how do you go about recognizing the fuller value of employment, of work, of family, of home ownership, of all of those items, and then asking yourself whether we could amortize that differently so that we can, because it will not help us to distort the market by refusing to recognize cost. The federal government now pays, 23 cents or 33 cents on every Medicaid dollar that's charged or whatever, somewhere in that neighborhood. They've just discounted it. That didn't make the cost go away per se. It just figured out in terms of how they were going to pay it at that moment in time. That's not sustainable. And so there's some very interesting questions here, I think, that sit on the table.
So I want to come back to something, Paul, that you said, and that's we've also got to figure out how to get out of the way of ourselves in some areas. Toss it to you first, but then I'll open it up to the full table of, are there other examples there of things that we might need to get out of the way of, or make some changes of from a public sector perspective to tangibly improve these areas of education, housing, reskilling, and more?
Yeah, I think there's some great opportunities. I think when you look at education, we're seeing some changes now that we haven't seen before. And I'll use the example. I use it all the time, and Cindy knows where I'm kind of going with this, is HERA. Higher Education Regional Alliance here in southeastern Wisconsin was created about 2.5 years ago, right after the Foxconn announcement was made, because the colleges said, you know what, we've got to figure out how we're going to prepare our workforce quicker. How are we going to get through with the degrees that we need? How are we going to be able to engage people more effectively? Well, they realized the best way to do it is they're going to compete against each other and collaborate at the exact same time. And that's when you start seeing a change in how we look at things. You look at WCTC, starting in June of next year, is going to an 8-week semester program. And I don't know if it's going to be quarters now or what they're going to call it. But instead of 16 weeks, they're breaking it down to 8 because that's the chunk of time people can utilize while they're still working. And they can stack their way to their degrees and work on the certificates. Those are the ideas. When we have government saying it takes you 8 to 10 months before we can figure out how a permit is properly set, then businesses have to suffer because we have to wait till they can get going. If we can figure out how to streamline the process so there's less touches in it as it moves forward, that's going to be our big key. And I think that's the challenge that we have. In fact, I was sitting here. I have ADD. I apologize. Tom Moe was the county administrator in Ozaukee County. And if anybody in the room knows Tom Moe, Tom had this heat map that showed what overlays of government we had in Wisconsin. And the darker the blue, the more levels of governance we had. Unfortunately, most of the state is this nice, deep, dark blue. And you start looking at what do we have to do to break through that to get things done more efficiently. 37 municipalities in Waukesha County, our goal is that when a permit comes in, the county accepts the municipality's information and allows it to kind of move forward so that we're not reinventing the wheel, as it was said earlier. Those are the things that we can look at doing, and I think we've got to continue to look at that from the state level as well, even the federal government, on where has the overreach occurred and how can we peel it back down to the closest level of governance which makes it most efficient.
Well, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. The cost of the cost of producing housing is bad enough. We talked about minimum lot sizes, and you mentioned Foxconn. I think there's municipalities around the Foxconn development that have 3-acre minimum lot sizes for a house. I mean, we need to be putting 300 units that close to that kind of a manufacturing facility. And the cost just skyrockets from there. Kaleem brought up the point, when you restrict the land available for buildable lots, the price goes up exponentially. And I think the national home builders have numbers about the percentage of a new construction that's attributable to government regulations or delays in permitting, et cetera. That's on the new home side. I'll throw another one that brings the education and the housing together that we could look at too, and it's the way we fund our schools. It's the way we fund local units of government. Wisconsin, if you take a graph about how we fund local government in the state of Wisconsin, triple any other state is our over-reliance on the property tax. And that's an antiquated system that was created back in a time when that made a little bit more sense, but it hasn't been updated forever. And we have limits on property taxes here because property taxes was too darn high on homeowners for too many years. We have to rethink how we do that. Because what happens when you do that? You pit a family that wants to live in a home in the area that they want to live in against the school district. And when I say housing is a differentiator for the future on how to retain and attract new workers, it's quality of life that goes around that home ownership that's equally important. And those are usually funded by property taxes in today's system. So garbage, snow removal, police and fire protection, all municipal services, transportation, schools, everything that goes into the quality of life that a homeowner enjoys and when they make a selection of a place to live is dependent on the taxes that they have to pay for those services. I think to the degree that Wisconsin diversifies the way local units of government pay for those services and get it off the property taxes, the more you're going to have a unanimity between local units of government and the property owner moving in the same direction.
You know, I was also going to say, if I was governor, I would propose to flatten the educational system from 4 systems to 3. We are double funding and triple funding education, and here's how. You know, there's very little money going into preschool education if you're not poor. The federal government passes money through to families who are working, going to school, you know, getting some job training assistance so they can provide education for their children early so they can go to work. But very few families gain access to that. Everyone else is on the free market. And we know that birth to 5 is the most critical time in a child's life, but it really is dependent upon your parents' ability to pay. So disadvantage and advantage is already hardwired into the system, but we really don't fund that publicly in Wisconsin. K through 12, we have that. Then we have tech schools / career education, and then we have higher education. I would propose to eliminate tech colleges and career education and bring it back to what it originally was. Tech colleges grew out of around World War II, grew out of high school. There was a need for more automation. There was a great expansion of industry. And so we created these alternative forms of educating large masses of people. But we don't need a system like that, my argument is, again. And when you look at what high schools are doing, they're trying to provide now more of what technical schools are providing and partnering with them and creating early college high school programs. But yet they're hiring 2 people to teach math. These people are hiring the same people to teach math. The tech colleges nationally have a 15% graduation rate in technical programs, 40 to 50% in their college transfer programs. That is a very low productive system. High schools have graduation rates somewhere between 50 to 80% or whatever, but it's like we're providing kids an education. They graduate from college, they go to college again, they take physics all over again. They take algebra all over again. They take calculus all over again. They do the exact same thing in their first 2 years of schooling, and it does not make sense in American education when we're trying to figure out how to cover the cost of this. So if we took all the funds that we are spending on these technical college systems in Wisconsin, and we figured out a way to provide a secondary education to young people, we're making the high schools work with our technical college systems, we would free up a lot of cash to actually invest in children birth to 5. So that's what I would propose. And I feel like we're at this point, somebody used the term rethinking. We have to rethink a lot of things in America, but we are so divided right now that we focus 90% of our time on divided thinking and strategy. and none on common sense thinking about the challenges we have in front of us. And so again, I think Wisconsin with our lightened Wisconsin idea, could move forward a great idea and figure out how very quickly to start a conversation, a real one, about how we eliminate all this redundancy and spending in education so we can spend it where it matters most.
Thank you. Jim?
Let me just build on what Kaleem just said, because I think he's right. There's a lot of redundancy that could be wrung out of the system. I'd take it one more step, and that is that I think it's time for us to begin to de-link time and learning. If you think about the traditional school semester, that's really how long it takes to teach, not how long it takes to learn. And so what happens is we sort of estimate how long it will take to teach a given set of content, and that's what we do, knowing full well that within every class are some students who can learn it at a much faster rate, others need more time. Instead of thinking about what the learner needs, we think about coverage and presentation. It creates inefficiency in the system that is incalculable. Because some students become bored and disengaged because what they're getting is redundant or not relevant or something they've already learned, while the student across who's sitting next to them may need a lot more background before they're even able to take advantage. And so it's built into the system. We don't even think about it. But if we're starting to de-link things, we really just started to ask the question, what's really important for young people to learn? And then starting with the learner, figure out how that path might work. The good news is we have the capacity to do that. We have examples of it. The problem we have is that we're all so stuck in the industrial model of education that it's hard for us to think about it differently.